We're getting close to the first 100 days winding down, and President Trump ramping up his push to cut taxes and at the same time revamp health care. We're going to take a look at whether he'll get anything major done before that artificial deadline, which is the end of the week. Then our panel of attorneys will join us and take a look at the court ruling that smacks down the White House's threat to pull money from sanctuary cities. Also, the gang violence so bad in Suffolk County, the county exec is asking the feds to come help fight it. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I am Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday evening. Tonight, we're going to get to our legal panel in a moment, but we begin with politics, and there's a lot of it in our nation's capital. Today, it was either a major milestone for the Trump administration's economic agenda or the latest example of the White House playing beat the clock, trying to show progress ahead of that 100th day in office for the president. And new proposals came out today on taxes as well as health care. Let me bring in now our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman, with the details, or at least the big ideas, because they're short on details. Right, Andrew?
Very well put, Rich. We have the broad strokes, but not exactly a lot of details. We'll begin with taxes and what had been billed as a generational proposal on tax reform, today looking a lot more like just a big tax cut. And if passed, it would be among the largest in American history. It was one of President Trump's key campaign promises, so his team is setting the stakes very high.
We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to do something really big.
Big and quite complicated. Yet the White House boiled down its principles to just one page of bullet points. The key elements of the president's proposal: slashing corporate taxes from 35% to 15%, a tax break for child care expenses, and cutting individual tax rates. The White House says it's moving as quickly as possible, working closely with the House and Senate with the goal of getting it done this year. But there are red flags going up all over Washington, big concerns about what this plan would do to the deficit. One analysis says the president's tax proposal could cost as much as $6 trillion in lost revenue over a decade. The Treasury Secretary insists this plan will pay for itself with economic growth. And as for the president releasing his own tax returns, Secretary Mnuchin made it clear that's not happening.
The president has no intention. The president has released plenty of information and I think has given more financial disclosure than anybody else. I think the American population has plenty of information.
Now, that Trump move on taxes coming the same day as the GOP formally revised its proposal on health care reform. Their new bill trying to walk a fine line on some popular aspects of Obamacare. For example, the new version keeps all of these popular planks from the ACA, from age 26 protections to pre-existing conditions, at least on the federal level. But the plan also allows states to opt out of those protections for pretty thin reasons, including if the changes would advance, quote, the public interest of the state, something that can be defined pretty loosely. But the far-right Freedom Caucus has already signaled its support for the revised health care plan, though we're not clear on the numbers or how more moderate Republicans are leaning. And Rich, the positioning, the moderate Republicans may determine whether there's a success or failure on this revised health care pitch.
All right, let's break these down into two pieces. Taxes. I think even though with both Mnuchin as well as Cohen getting pressed for details, they made it clear, and certainly before the 100 days, you're just getting the broad strokes of the idea. It kind of resembles, if people go back to under Reagan, remember the Laffer curve, that Stanford basically economist who said, hey, if you just cut taxes for everybody, it'll create all those jobs. It didn't work. But nonetheless, he campaigned on it, promised on it. Where it will be really interesting is they stressed one big point was they're going to cut corporate taxes. I think there's agreement in Washington that it's a little confiscatory, 30-some-odd% right now for corporations. You cut it down to 15%, it would make more sense. But what they didn't say, and what is implied is, if you've offshored profits right now, and we have trillions of dollars in corporations' profits overseas, it's not 15% they'll tax you on. They'll even give you a bigger incentive and a smaller tax rate to bring that in. It could have unforeseen consequences, people taking profits this fiscal year and shoving them overseas and everything else. And there could be a big backlash here because Joe Sixpack's going to be paying a lot more taxes than said corporation, who's almost being rewarded for not being a corporate citizen.
Anytime you're talking about tax policy, the devil's in the details. So if you want to cut the corporate tax rate from 35% down to 15%, that's fine. There might actually be broad support for that. But what are you going to do about other corporate loopholes? You talked about offshoring money, other tax breaks that businesses get. There's widespread support for lowering the corporate tax rate if you get rid of these other loopholes. But again, we have no details and no specifics here as to whether the president is actually looking to do that. So whether this gets majority support in Congress will depend on those details.
But the big thing as it relates to taxes, Andrew, was Trump campaigned that he was going to slash the deficit. And that, you know, how irresponsible the previous administration was and those before him. He knew how to balance the books. And again, he's got a constituency of Republicans in Congress, which include the Freedom Caucus, who believe in pay-go, that you're going to make all the numbers add up the right way. They don't care what social programs you cut, what is, we'll get into a second, you slash out of, in effect, the ACA or whatever else. Just get the numbers right. They today, both Mnuchin and Cohen, basically were saying, hey, you know, as long as the deficits aren't that bad, or they're not as bad as were for Obama, or we're going to grow this at 3% nationally or annually, the economy, so it'll all turn out fine. I don't know if there's enough go along to get along here on just within Republican circles to get behind this.
There may be, if only just because tax cutting is such a universal plank in the Republican platform, whether you're a moderate Republican or the most conservative member of the Freedom Caucus, you support lowering taxes. So the idea of lowering taxes in and of itself, very popular. As for the impact on the deficit, we talked a lot about this during the healthcare debate. The Congressional Budget Office scores out these sorts of things, but under Republican leadership, it uses something called dynamic scoring, which, as you mentioned with the Laffer curve, projects or assumes that if you cut taxes, you're going to get a huge explosion in economic growth, and that huge explosion in economic growth means even though you're paying at a lower rate, there's more money to be taxed, so that winds up making the same amount of money.
It's never worked.
It's never worked, and you can go back to the Reagan tax cuts, the 2 Bush tax cuts for both Presidents Bush, or you want to look right now in the state of Kansas. Governor Brownback in Kansas slashed the state's taxes across the board in what he called a big experiment in tax policy, and it absolutely has not worked, to the point where his Republican legislature has overridden his vetoes to actually increase taxes in the state. Why? They didn't have enough money for schools. They didn't have enough money for
Police,
road repaving, police.
Law enforcement, everything else. Second big thing today, the second crack at the apple, if you will, at repeal and replace Obamacare. And I want to get to a couple polls which I thought were really interesting. And again, these came from the Washington Post and the ABC. When the public was given 2 choices with, call it Obamacare on the first one, keep it and improve it, or get rid of it and do Trump care, if you will, you see the numbers. It's not even close. And that's before everybody fully puts their arms around what it would mean. If they realized, Andrew, the latest version that you talked about that's going through, pre-existing conditions, no more. You're going to leave it up to states here. In certain states, we know what's going to happen right now. I mean, there are so many things that people would be slack-jawed as to what this proposal could actually do, that I think the numbers go to, 80 to 20 or something else. It's a potential landmine for Republicans.
And the other poll that we have is what I call the You Break It, You Bought It poll. We've talked about this a little bit before from the Kaiser Family Foundation. That's who's responsible for problems with the Affordable Care Act going forward. And Trump owns it by a 2-to-1 ratio at this point, and that number will get even more skewed as time goes on. So Trump may feel pressure to do something on health care, and we know that he certainly made it an important plank. Look, in terms of figuring out who's going to get blamed for it, or whether this gets personalized to people in particularly red states or states that voted for Trump, that's going to be a sales pitch issue, because Trump, with this proposal, can plausibly look at the camera and say, I'm not cutting off your protections up to age 26. I'm not cutting off your protections for pre-existing conditions. I'm not cutting off your prenatal and your maternity leave care.
He can say it, Andrew, but he's still got to sign it.
He's giving it, but he is presenting it to the states and letting them make the decision.
But just like it became called Obamacare, and whatever happened after it, the devil be in the details, it's going to be called Trump care. And we're going to hear the stories about people that got hurt, that we're okay now, they'll be hurt in the future, they can't pay. For example, there's a provision of the ACA which basically subsidizes so that people on the bottom end of the economic spectrums or households making 61 grand or less, in effect they pay $1,000 for something right now. It would go to, under this proposal, to 10 grand, out-of-pocket expenses. People will realize $1,000 versus $10,000 for health care, or pre-existing conditions where it was covered before. All of a sudden, mom's breast cancer treatment now all of a sudden won't be cared under this one. They just know, I had some before, I don't have it now. What changed? Oh, the guy in the White House. Okay, let's get to brass tacks. Friday, we're not going to have a government shutdown, are we?
No. Almost no. Even the White House look, the White House's biggest plank on this was holding the wall funding hostage. They've recanted on that. They've relented on that. So no, it's in nobody's best interest for the government to shut down. So that doesn't look like it's going to happen. Now, keep in mind, we're also dealing with the president's first 100 days, so there's almost no chance that this health care proposal is going to get through. I told you the Freedom Caucus has announced its support. That means at least 80% of its members say that they would vote for it. But the big chorus that I'm hearing out of Washington today are moderate Republicans saying, hey, I just came back from talking to my constituents. They will kill me if I vote for this thing.
And the senator already said it's dead on arrival. So and they're going to hope to get out of the House, it would never get.
And they're going to try to craft their own proposal. This tax reform proposal also, nothing is going to happen this week. So, you know,
it's going to be. I think it's months.
It's just, yeah, and they're hoping their timeline is by the end of the year. So they're hoping to get these proposals before the public by this deadline of 100 days, but don't expect any action on either of these between now and Friday.
So, in one breath, the president says he doesn't care about this 100 days. It's some artificial number. We've played clips ad nauseum about how he talked about all the different things, the contract that he offered with this country that he would do in the first 100 days, his 10 big planks. In short, he's done one of them, okay? Nonetheless, at the end of the week, when the 100-day rings in and you don't have a shutdown, are we all where we are now, right now? We have a president with historically bad poll numbers. Can he turn anything around at this point or not, albeit by an artificial number?
I don't think that accomplishing what he sets out to accomplish or whatever the criteria is by this 100 days will seriously impact his numbers. It's sort of on an item-by-item basis. Unless we get a change in the presentation, in the structure that the White House approaches these things, I don't think we're going to see big changes in the president's numbers. And just to clarify, the president doesn't care about knocking off his checklist by the 100-day deadline. He cares that he'll be perceived well, regardless of whether he does the stuff that's on that list or not. I don't think there's enough time for him to change that perception between now and Friday.
And here's the stuff the public didn't really dig into deep. I guarantee you, the next 30 days after this week, they're going to be harder than the first 100. Because all of a sudden, you got to start passing stuff. You can't just talk about it. And when people learn what's in it, it becomes a lot less palatable.
Been pretty difficult for the first 100 days. I'm not sure how it could get much more difficult
I'll
for him.
take bets that it will. All right, Andrew, thank you very much. Now, all week here, we will be looking at the first 100 days, and we're going to, as we always do, want to get your perspective here. So please, email us. You see our address right there, RFL. You go to rnntv.com, tell us what you have to say, whether you think it's been a success, failure, what you'd like to see happen next, where you've been disappointed, positively pleased. Either way, we want to get your perspective. All right, coming up next, another federal court has yet again blocked another one of Trump's immigration crackdown proposals. It is the third time it's happened, as we've said, in the first 100 days. We're going to show you how the president reacted, and I'll give you a hint, not too well.